first set of remains, discovered on December 11th, 2010, seemed like an accident at first. A search for a missing woman, Shannan Gilbert, quickly spiraled into something darker as Malia's dog, Blue, picked up the distinct scent that led them down a dense, snow-covered path near Gilgo Beach. What they found was horrifying. The bodies were found within 500 feet of each other, almost like the killer had become too comfortable with his work, too familiar with the location, and had begun to view it as his own personal dumping ground. Each victim, Maureen Brainard-Barnes, Melissa Barthélemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello, had been bound in similar ways, with tape, belts, and ropes, and wrapped in the same burlap material. Their faces, barely recognizable, told a terrible truth. They weren't random victims. They had been chosen. Malia took a deep breath as he crouched down to inspect the scene. His hands were trembling. He hated the way he felt when he was forced to face this ugliness. The cold reality of the lives lost here was something he could never fully prepare for. The faces of these women, their humanity, began to blur in his mind. Each was more than just a body. But in that moment, in the chilling silence of the beach, their stories had not yet been told. He could feel their absence, the emptiness left by unheard voices. And as Malia looked at the bodies before him, a thought formed in his mind, a gnawing question. Who had these women been before they were left like this? The search for Shannan Gilbert is where the case begins to unravel. Her disappearance wasn't like the others. She wasn't found alongside the others on Ocean Parkway. Her fate had been different. A panicked 911 call followed by an abrupt disappearance that left her lost in the cold marshlands near Oak Beach. Gilbert's case had initially been seen as an isolated incident, a possible case of foul play linked to the seedy world of escorting. But Malia couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this. After hearing her desperate 911 call, he couldn't accept the simple theory of an accidental drowning. There was something more sinister beneath the surface. As the investigation continued, the task force began connecting more dots. Gilbert's call had been a cry for help, a plea to a stranger on the other end of the line. The frantic words had left a deep impression on Malia. He couldn't understand how someone could leave a woman so vulnerable, so terrified, alone in the dark of night. And yet, she wasn't the only one. As Malia and his team worked tirelessly to uncover Shannan Gilbert's fate, the pattern between the victims began to surface more clearly. There was a method to the madness, an unmistakable signature. As the number of bodies grew, so did the realization that this was no random killer. This was someone who had been stalking his victims, preparing for each murder as if it were a sick, twisted ritual. The next few months were a blur of investigative work, forensic analysis, and endless dead ends. Malia's team worked tirelessly to compile evidence, cross-reference old reports, and search for any connection. They relied heavily on forensic anthropology to confirm that the bodies belonged to sex workers, a detail that made many people uncomfortable, particularly in the beginning. But the victims' identities were critical pieces of the puzzle. They weren't just statistics, and Malia refused to let them be dismissed as simply missing girls or prostitutes. They were women with names, families, and dreams. They had a life before they were murdered, and Malia's mind refused to let go of that fact. Every victim was a personal tragedy. As Malia examined the photos of the victims, their eyes stared back at him, haunting him. They were real people. They didn't deserve this, Malia whispered to himself as he continued through the paperwork, his heart heavy. A breakthrough came in March 2012 when investigators focused on a Chevrolet Avalanche that had been spotted near the site of Amber Costello's disappearance. The vehicle, registered to Rex Heuermann, a Manhattan architect, had been seen in the area at the time of her disappearance. This revelation marked a turning point in the case. Heuermann had no known criminal history, but his name kept coming up in random conversations with witnesses, a troubling pattern. When investigators dug deeper, they discovered that Heuermann's truck had been near the locations where several victims had been found. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together. Malia's stomach tightened when he realized the implications. This was the moment when the investigation shifted from chasing shadows to something far more real. Rex Heuermann was becoming the central figure. The truth was beginning to surface. But Malia couldn't help but wonder, was he just getting started? Or was this the end? After months of surveillance, Rex Heuermann's arrest in July 2023 shook everyone to their core. The man who had been living just down the street from the Gilgo Beach site, hiding in plain sight, was now in custody. But the discovery did not bring the closure that the victims' families had been hoping for. Malia, standing outside the courtroom, watches as Heuermann is escorted into the building. He knows what everyone else is thinking. The perfect suburban architect with a family and success had been hiding something much darker beneath the surface. For Shannan Gilbert's family, the news is bittersweet. The man who might have taken their daughter's life had finally been arrested. But the reality of it was still too raw. They had fought for years to get to this point, and the victory felt hollow in the face of the pain they carried. A press conference, months later, would be the next major turning point. Malia and his team stood before reporters, cameras flashing, and the weight of the case was suddenly visible in the form of the tired faces of the investigators. It was here that Malia felt the gravity of it all. The case that had consumed his life for years had now morphed into a media spectacle. The families had demanded justice for so long, but now, even though they had the arrest they had longed for, the darker truth was still ahead of them. Who was Rex Heuermann, really? What had driven him to commit these terrible crimes? As the camera flashes stopped and the room fell silent, Malia's mind wandered. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The hunt for justice was beginning. On a cold December morning, Detective John Malia stood in the darkened, empty room. The quiet broken only by the hum of the fluorescent lights above. He closed his eyes briefly, as though trying to block out the years of frustration and endless dead ends. The photographs laid out on the table in front of him still haunted him. The faces of the women, smiling, alive, before they were discarded. The brutal deaths, each one a brutal echo of the last. He picked up the photograph of Brainard-Barnes, the smallest of the victims, a smile on her face. A promise of a future lost. The quiet in the room now felt suffocating, as if all the voices of the women, their dreams, their families, their cries for justice, had been trapped in these images. Malia exhaled slowly, feeling a growing weight in his chest. The weight of unanswered questions, unfinished business, justice still pending. Then, from the silence, a voice in his head spoke with a bitter truth. This is far from over.
The defendant is now charged with the murder of 7 young women. Sandra Castilla from 1993, Valerie Mack from 2000, Jessica Taylor from 2003, Maureen Brainard-Barnes from 2007, Melissa Bartholomew from 2009, Megan Waterman from 2010 in June, and Amber Costello from September of 2010.
The case had been cold for so long. No one had been prepared for the true depth of horror it would reveal. In the years following the first body discoveries in 2010, authorities had hoped that a breakthrough would come. But time passed. Each cold lead, each failed interview only sank them deeper into despair. Shannan Gilbert's case had been a false start, after all. A woman lost in the marshlands, running scared, possibly confused by an abusive client or a threatening situation. It had been tragic, but it hadn't seemed to connect to anything larger. At least, not at first. But Malia couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Then, one night in March 2012, Malia came across a report that would shake everything to its core. Rex Heuermann. A name that had come up repeatedly but never investigated fully, until now. An architect from Massapequa Park, a man whose name had appeared in reports of witness sightings and unconfirmed tips. This wasn't a man with a violent history. He wasn't the obvious suspect. But the coincidences were undeniable. Malia's thoughts were clear. We had to investigate. We had no choice. It wasn't just Heuermann's name that gave Malia pause. It was the vehicle, the Chevrolet Avalanche. A witness had reported seeing this exact truck near Amber Costello's last known location on the night she vanished. It had been parked close to where Costello's body had been discovered months later, along Ocean Parkway, just miles from where the Gilgo Beach 4 were found. A tiny detail, but details mattered. This was it. The the breakthrough that started unraveling everything. Malia's pulse quickened as the pieces began to fall into place. Heuermann hadn't just been a fleeting name. He had been there, right in front of them. He had been so close to the victims, and yet no one had seen him. It was no longer about looking for a killer. It was about finding out how he had done it. What kind of person had methodically taken life for years, no one ever suspecting him? What did he want? What did he need? The investigation had always been about facts, about connecting dots. But for Malia, there was something much deeper happening now. He wasn't just a detective anymore. He was a man haunted by the grief of the families left behind. The guilt of the victims, their lost futures, now kept him up at night. They were no longer just names and faces on paper. They were real people, real lives that had been stolen. In an interview with Maureen Brainard-Barnes' mother, the emotional toll was clear. Her voice, barely holding it together, spoke about her daughter's dream of becoming a nurse, a woman who had fought for a better life. The soft sadness in her words cut through Malia like a knife. This was the heart of it. These were not just women discarded like garbage by a man who believed himself above consequences. They were human beings, and Malia couldn't allow their stories to remain untold. He clutched the photos again. There had to be something. Someone who had seen something. No more secrets. In the days and weeks following the new lead, Malia and his team worked tirelessly to track down Heuermann's movements. His truck had been at key locations, his presence undeniable. But it wasn't just his vehicle. His phone had pinged near the crime scenes, connecting him to the very places where the victims had disappeared. The new discovery, a burner phone used in the days before Amber Costello's death, was a critical piece of evidence. Malia and his team learned that Heuermann had been using multiple phones at the time of the murders, all linked to his work, the architectural firm, his professional life that had seemingly shielded his darker side. But the truth was becoming clearer. Heuermann had been in constant contact with the women. The phones were used to manipulate and isolate them. The images of Heuermann's house were just as telling. As investigators combed through the 350 electronic devices seized from his home, a pattern began to emerge. Violent pornography, tied directly to the victim's injuries, torture, restraints, and mutilation. His obsession with control and power over these women was now horribly clear. Malia knew they were closer now. But the deeper he went into Heuermann's psyche, the more disturbing it became. Was he just a killer? Or was this about something much darker? The arrest of Rex Heuermann in July 2023 was a moment of sickening clarity. For Malia, it was a culmination of everything they had worked for. But the shock of it wasn't just in the arrest. It was the fact that Heuermann had been living so close, had been right in front of their eyes the entire time. The unassuming architect, living in a well-kept suburban home, married with children, he had hidden in plain sight. His life, his public persona, had been a mask to conceal his dark desires. His neighbors hadn't suspected a thing. They described him as quiet, distant, but nothing that would raise alarm. And yet, in the quiet of his home, he had been orchestrating unspeakable violence. The shock of his arrest hit everyone, even his wife, Asa Ellerup. She couldn't believe it. How could she not have seen the truth? How could she not have noticed the darker side of the man she had lived with for years? The revelations about his family's involvement, his wife's hair found on the victims' bodies, felt like a betrayal of its own. How far had Heuermann gone to hide his true self, even from the people closest to him? The case was no longer just about catching a killer. It had become about the monster hiding inside a seemingly ordinary man, a man who had been able to manipulate the system with terrifying ease. The very structure of his life, his family, had acted as a cover, a distraction, while he hunted his victims. As the news spread and the media frenzy escalated, the question remained, what now? For the families, the arrest brought a small sense of closure, but it wasn't over yet. The trial loomed large, and the evidence against Heuermann was mounting. Would justice be served? For Malia, the moral weight of it all pressed down harder than ever. His focus had never wavered from the victims, but he couldn't ignore the larger truth that was unfolding. The fact that a man like Heuermann could slip through the cracks for so long, undetected, was a symptom of something far more systemic. The legal battle ahead would be grueling. Heuermann's lawyers were already fighting to invalidate DNA evidence. The evidence of his obsession with violence, his collection of torture pornography, would be a crucial aspect of the trial. But would the jury understand the full scope of the monster behind the mask? Malia stood in front of the courthouse, looking out at the frenzied media and the growing crowds. The weight of the case was now palpable. The road ahead would be long, and justice, though inching closer, was still far from certain. As the doors to the courtroom swung open, the next phase of this investigation was beginning. Malia, though weary, stood firm. He knew they were not just fighting for justice for these victims. They were fighting to make sure something like this could never happen again. The question lingered in the air as Malia entered the courthouse. Was this truly the end? Or was Heuermann just a small part of something much bigger? The stakes were only growing higher. The trial had just begun, but with each new revelation, the sense of unease only deepened. Who else was complicit in this monstrous deception? And how many more had Heuermann hurt over the years? The truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Detective John Malia's words hang in the air, like the heavy silence in the courtroom. Rex Heuermann sits just feet away, his posture unnervingly relaxed, a stark contrast to the energy of the room. His eyes scan the proceedings, unreadable, almost detached. His family sits behind him, visibly tense, but Heuermann remains composed. The emotional landscape of this moment is complicated. There is a deep sense of disbelief mixed with anger. The truth is now inescapable. Rex Heuermann, a family man, an architect, a member of society, is the man responsible for the deaths of 7 women. But his calm demeanor is a chilling testament to the monstrosity hidden beneath his seemingly ordinary exterior. This is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of understanding the twisted face of evil that had long lived in plain sight. The court is filled with an eerie stillness. As the judge reads the charges, Rex Heuermann listens with an eerie calm, his face betraying no emotion. His body language is almost nonchalant, an unsettling contrast to the intense media presence and the weight of the charges that could define his fate. Malia, sitting in the back, watches intently, trying to reconcile the man in front of him with the monstrous figure the evidence has painted. This is the face of evil, Malia thinks, his mind racing. He's seen the gruesome images. He's watched as the bodies of the victims were carefully examined, processed, and analyzed. And now, he's staring at the man who had for years woven a mask of normalcy while his true self, the predator, lurked in the shadows. Heuermann's defense attorney argues that the evidence is circumstantial. But Malia knows better. He knows that the burner phones, the DNA collected from a discarded pizza crust, and the psychological profile of the killer all point to one man. And yet, as Heuermann sits in that chair, he refuses to flinch. He denies it all. But the truth is already unraveling. Heuermann's public life had painted a different picture. The neighborhood knew him as a quiet, reserved architect. He was the father of 2 children and a husband to Asa Ellerup. To the outside world, he seemed like an ordinary man, someone who blended into suburban life without making waves. But his private life told a darker story. Years before the discovery of the Gilgo Beach murders, Heuermann was already leading a double life, one hidden beneath layers of deception. Inside his home in Massapequa Park, the stark contrast to his public persona is revealed. Investigators find digital pornography, including disturbing images that suggest a long-standing fascination with violence, bondage, and mutilation. Key elements that align disturbingly well with the manner in which the victims were disposed of. Ellerup, his wife, struggles with the horror of what her husband is accused of. "I don't know who this man is anymore," she says in an interview, her voice trembling with disbelief. She never suspected anything out of the ordinary. They had been together for nearly 3 decades. How could she have missed the signs? Her grief is suffused with guilt, not just for herself, but for her children who now have to face the unimaginable truth. As Heuermann's arrest begins to reverberate throughout the community, Malia is confronted with the same question that had haunted him since the beginning. How could someone so seemingly normal have committed such atrocities? Rex Heuermann is not the stereotypical serial killer. a disheveled, lonely figure living in squalor. Instead, he is the high-functioning predator, the kind that blends seamlessly into society, capable of leading a family life while secretly satisfying his twisted urges. Psychological profiling becomes crucial in understanding the depths of his depravity. Forensic psychologists begin to construct a profile of Heuermann, a man driven by a need to control, to dominate, and to destroy. As the investigation deepens, more information surfaces. The burner phones that Heuermann used to contact the victims, the meticulous planning, the eerie silence he maintained during his acts of violence, all point to a man who wasn't simply a murderer, but someone who derived satisfaction from being the puppet master, controlling the lives of his victims and, by extension, the investigation itself. His calm, measured demeanor in court further illustrates his narcissism and lack of empathy, painting a clear picture of a man who viewed the world and its people as mere objects to be manipulated. One of the most chilling aspects of Heuermann's crimes is his methodical approach. This is not the work of an impulsive killer, but a cold, calculated individual who took pleasure in the precision of his actions. The way he disposed of his victims, bodies bound with burlap and tape, was not just about evading detection. It was about sending a message. To who? Perhaps to the women he killed, but perhaps more poignantly, to the system that had failed to protect them. The victim's profession as sex workers looms large in the narrative. Malia struggles with the system's disregard for their lives. The media, the public, and even some police officers had dismissed the victims' deaths as less important, as if their lives were worth less because of their occupation. This narrative resonates deeply with Malia as he watches the trial unfold, seeing Heuermann's defense lawyer try to reduce the horror of the murders to mere circumstantial evidence. The way society viewed the victims, and continues to view them, adds another layer of complexity to the case. Heuermann's victims were not just murdered, they were ignored, neglected by both the killer and the very system meant to protect them. The trial moves forward, and the tension intensifies as the evidence piles up against Heuermann. His family, particularly his wife, seems to fall apart in front of the cameras. Ella Rupp is torn between standing by her husband and confronting the terrifying reality that the man she loved for so many years is, in fact, a monster. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Heuermann maintains his innocence, his body language in court a study of denial. His posture remains stiff, his gaze unyielding, as if he still believes that somehow, some way, he will convince the world of his innocence. But as the trial continues, the system that failed the victims slowly begins to make amends. For Malia, the process is a relentless pursuit of justice, not just for the victims, but for the families who have suffered in silence for far too long. As the case nears its conclusion, the specter of uncertainty looms over the trial. Was Heuermann working alone? Or was he part of something much larger, a network of evil too complex to fully comprehend? Malia remains fixated on the thought that there may be others out there still walking free. The prosecutor's final arguments echo in the courtroom. We are here because of the lives that were stolen from us, and we are here to ensure that those who remain, the ones who loved these women, finally get justice. Heuermann sits, his face a blank mask. The final words of the trial hang in the air, and the world watches as the jury deliberates. As the courtroom stands in a heavy silence, the question still remains. Was Rex Heuermann the only one responsible for the horror of Gilgo Beach? As he is led away in handcuffs, the haunting image of his blank stare lingers. The case may be closing, but the questions about his true role and the role of others are still very much open.